Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Susan Reynolds with Friends for Survival, and today we are honored to welcome Sondra Sexton-Jones. First, I'd like to introduce our Executive Director, Marilyn Koenig. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Okay, thank you so much for viewing this webinar. We're glad to welcome you. Our special guest, as Susan said, who is our project manager and takes care of all the technical skills that I don't have. She is always available for us to help us with our Zoom meetings. And our guest for this day is Sondra Sexton-Jones. We met probably in about 1987 at an AAS meeting for the very first time, shortly after the death of her husband, Ray. And we were just kind of a small group of women who had lost somebody in our family, and we thought we would kind of check out this national organization called American Association of Suicidology and see if we could learn something, if we could have some input, and if we could make a difference, and could we get some help from them, because we didn't know what to do. So Sondra, it's been years since I've actually seen you at a meeting, but we have kept in contact over the years, all these years. So we're long-term friends. And how about you tell us a little bit about your bio? Because I know it's changed quite a bit over the years. Tell us a little bit about your bio.
So, born and raised in Texas. I'm told I still have an accent. I don't hear that, but and I moved to Alaska in 1993. I had lived in Texas and all my life, and visited Alaska at the time my sister was alive, and fell in love with the state and really wanted to come back and work. But I didn't want to go on what they call the fish line, which is where, that didn't appeal to me. So I went back to school. Ray and I married. We met through a friend, and Ray and I married in 1980. And I was in school at the time, working on my bachelor's degree. And then I had started my master's at Texas Women's University, not with the idea of, of coming back. Never entered my mind until later on about coming back or coming to Alaska. Anyway, so after his death, it took me a while to get on my feet and to figure out what I was going to do and how I was going to live. But one of the interesting things about my master's program was that when this happened, and I let my professor know that I wouldn't be at school one day because my husband had killed himself. Later on, conversations from two of my professors told me that I shouldn't talk about his death as being a suicide, because I would be, actually perhaps ruining my career as a professional therapist. And I thought that was rather odd. So I began talking about it, not only to friends, but just, to other people that I bumped into. And that was the reason. I can't remember how I found out about AAS, Marilyn, but that was the reason that I went to my first AAS meeting. And I think it was through one of the support groups in Dallas, probably the crisis center, because they had a lot of groups and a lot of resources. And so then that sort of started my trajectory as far as getting well schooled in what is called trauma therapy. And through the years have built, I've been in Alaska now since 1993. And so far as I know, I'm probably one of the few clinicians here in town that works with first responders and survivors of suicide. So, had the unfortunate thing was that I have 4 grandchildren. I have 4 great grandchildren. Ray doesn't know any of them. He didn't know any of them. So they have grown up hearing stories about him, but they didn't know him at all.
Hmm. Well, tell us a little bit about who Ray was. You must have been pretty impressed with him when you met him in college.
We had an interesting relationship because when we met, I was looking for somebody that would help me put some insurances in place, life insurance, and he happened to be the person that I was introduced to. And we just kind of hit it off. It was really kind of interesting how it happened. And the relationship just sort of unfolded. And then in 1980, November of 1980, we married. And one of the funny things that he said when we were standing down in front of the priests, he looked at me and he leaned over and he said, "So what have you gotten us into this time, Stanley?" Yeah, he had a good sense of humor. He was everybody's go-to guy when anything happened, in any of his friends. He was the one that people would go to for help, which is, I guess, one of the things that startled me so about him taking his own life was because then I was left, with having to lean heavily on some of our friends. Yeah, he had a great sense of humor. We traveled well together, and he was great with my kids. They were in their teenage years, those wonderful teenage years where you just want to put them off in a corner and let them develop a little bit. And he was great with the kids. He really was great. So he has been missed all of these years. And there are still, there are times when I'll think of something and just get a good laugh.
In our meetings twice a year, normally, we do talk about the person that died. Who were they before they died? Because there are so many fascinating, wonderful, wonderful stories. People who die by suicide have amazing lives before that last few minutes of their life. And that gets lost in how they die, as opposed to who they were and who they still are to us. Who they still are to us. So that's why I wanted you to tell me a little bit about Ray himself.
Well, another point about him, he wasn't just involved in insurance. He was also a newsman. He worked for one of the radio stations there in Dallas. And he called me one day and he said, turn on the radio, turn on the radio. And I thought, holy crummy buttons, what is this about? He had placed a call. I don't know. I mean, this is a long time ago. He had placed a call to the embassy in Iran and had gotten hold of a janitor. Remember when the hostages were in Iran? Well, he had gotten a hold of a janitor over there and was having this conversation, broken English and everything, but was having this conversation with a janitor in Iran trying to ask questions to get information about the hostages. So, and then the other big thing that he was involved in, he was one of the newsmen when President Kennedy was killed. I still have all of his badges and everything that he had to have, his ID that he had to have working around that particular story.
What some great stories you have. So
yeah,
tell us, what were some of the unique aspects, do you think, of your grief at losing a spouse? Because we do have a meeting once a month, a Zoom meeting once a month for people who have lost their spouses or their partners. And the different relationships have unique aspects of grief.
Right.
So what do you think were the unique aspects that you had losing Ray in 1986?
Yeah. I think one of the things that struck me so was that because I saw him as always being steady. I saw him as always being there because he was, in different things that would happen in our lives, and a very calm individual, and always saying, well, let's look at this like yada, 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 and never didn't have much of a temper. He could get annoyed. And then that was gone. And I was left having to figure out how I was going to live without that sounding board. So that was a huge hole for me to climb up out of.
Yeah. And you still had children that were teenagers or almost teenagers or just young
Right.
adults?
Yeah, they were young adults by that time. They excuse me, they were both in school, and had to come home from school. They were both in college and came home, and the phone calls, I think the phone calls that I had to make that night to people, because I knew I didn't want to, there were decisions that I made that night that actually I look back on it and it's astonishing to me that I had the wherewithal to do that. But I called several of his friends and asked them to come to the house after I had told them what had happened. And then we made the phone calls. I had some help with making the phone calls to my kids, because he had walked my daughter. Well, I guess Deirdre had gotten married. She was in her second year, I guess, of college, and he walked her down the aisle. She was just devastated, absolutely devastated, and losing him. I think it was different for my son, but with Deirdre, she was devastated. And so, when you're trying to hold things together for your kids because you don't want them to think that all of a sudden they're going to have to alter their lives any, to come take care of mom. I learned a lot, Marilyn, about the way that I handle significant events, because I have a tendency to get right to the heart of the matter and I can figure out pretty quickly what I need to do. In that instance, when I lost him, I couldn't do it. I couldn't think, because the only thing that hit me was I had found him. And I relied on people, to help me through that.
So I would guess that your perception of suicide prior to Ray's death changed dramatically, and including your professional life as you were trying to pursue a career in psychology, in some aspect of psychology.
Right.
So
I didn't.
how do you
Go ahead.
think your perspective changed?
Well, first of all, I didn't know that much about suicide. I had not experienced a suicide in a family. And so I didn't know that much about suicide. And in school, even in the master's program that I was in, learning to be a counselor, believe it or not, suicide was not covered. It was not talked about. We didn't do anything. The only thing that we did that we were supposed to do, as directed by the professors, was that if anybody's suicidal, you got to get them to sign a piece of paper saying that they won't hurt themselves.
And that was it.
And that was it. And it was like, then you just send them off out of your office. Well, I don't use that, Marilyn. I've never asked anyone to sign a sheet of paper, because I think it is a false narrative. It doesn't matter if they sign a note or not, if they are in such dire straits then, and if that's what's on their mind, then they may very well, carry it out, whether or not they sign something, a declaration saying they're not going to hurt themselves. So I've never used them. And I've talked a lot to the clients, that are suicidal, and have had, suicidal episodes. And I've asked them, what would you have done if I had asked you to sign a piece of paper saying that, you wouldn't hurt yourself? And I had one young man, he just said, Sondra, I would have signed anything, because he said, I knew what my plan was if I was going to carry it out. He said a piece of paper wouldn't have mattered to me. So I've never asked anyone to sign a piece of paper. So the other thing that, as far as my perception is concerned, is that I have worked really, really diligently with helping a client understand that when we talk about suicide, we talk about where they are in their life, we talk about the pit that they're in. But I have told my clients I will walk with them until we get to a better place. But their decision as to whether or not they live or die does not rest with me, it rests with them. And then we try to dig ourselves out of the hole.
And it is a matter of digging ourselves out of the hole.
It absolutely, sometimes it's, eyelash by eyelash, so to speak. So, yeah.
Can you think of some special ways that you used for yourself to dig yourself out of that hole after Ray died?
I spent a great deal of time over at some friend's house over in far north Dallas, because I was afraid of the dark. I had never been afraid of the dark in my life, but I couldn't stand being in a dark house, and I couldn't stand being at the house where he had killed himself. And so that they just opened their house up to me. And so I spent a good bit of time over there. And if there were things that were hard for me to do, one and or both of them were there to help me. And so I leaned on people, and they were kind enough, and we're still friends. They were kind enough and gentle enough, to understand a lot about what I needed. They came with me we had a crisis class at TWU, and my professor asked me if there was a chance of us coming up there and talking about what it was like for them to have a friend that had experienced a suicide of a spouse, and what they had seen and what they had done to help me. So we did that class.
Wow.
And it was amazing. And so the question came to the husband about, how did you know how to help her? And his answer, I've got that recorded somewhere. His answer was, Sondra was always very clear about what she needed and what she wanted. And he said, we just tried to make sure that she got that.
That's an amazing thing that he said, because I remember back when my son died, I didn't know what I needed and what I wanted. I mean, I just couldn't think. I was just like frozen.
Yeah.
I mean, somebody, people say, well, whatever you need, I will help you, but I couldn't tell him what I needed. So we're all very different in our grief.
Absolutely.
You were fortunate enough to be able to reach out, say what you needed, and also had some friends that knew you well enough beforehand that were willing to also be that helpful person. So friends are extremely important at a time like this.
Absolutely.
And sometimes you meet new friends, and so they're the new friends that are helpful to you, even if maybe you didn't have good friends before. Somewhere you meet somebody, and they take you under their wing and are willing to sit with you while you cry, sit with you while you're just distressed.
Yeah, well, and you're so vulnerable, You are so vulnerable. You know, there are things that I look back on, and one of the things that I could not do when it came that winter was because he had driven the truck into our garage, and that's where I found him. And I couldn't drive my car, Marilyn, into the garage.
I've heard that before.
Yeah. So anyway, I called Fred and Lucy, and Fred happened to answer the phone. And I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't get my car in the garage. And this was his response. I'll come out there and put it in for you.
Oh, wow.
And I said to him, I said, Fred, I said, that would be great. But I said, I have to figure out a way to get my car in because it's winter and I didn't want it sitting out. And I said, maybe if you stay on the phone and let me go see if I can get the car in the garage, then I'll come back and we'll talk. And so that's how I got my car started to where I could put it into the garage.
Oh,
And I
wow.
got it in there and, you know, made a mad dash back to the phone, and we talked for a while after that. But that's the kind of people they were, you know.
Wow.
And he was originally. So can I tell you a funny story?
Yes.
It's it has a little bit of macabre to it, but it really is just funny. So Ray was born and raised in Oklahoma, and that's where he was buried. And so one day in, I don't know, a number of years, I think it was the latter part of 80s, first part of the 90s, I realized, because I was driving back and forth when I'd want to go to visit the cemetery, it was a 3-hour drive up to where he was buried. And so I called the funeral director and I said, so I have a question to ask. And my question was, do people ever come to you and say they think they buried their loved one in the wrong place and they want to move them? And he said, oh yeah. He said, we do that all the time, Sondra. He said, who do you want to move? And I said, I think I want to bring Ray back to Dallas. This was where his life was. And he looked at me and he said, you know, he said, all of us wondered why you were burying him up there. So the joke in the family has been Ray liked to travel. We traveled a lot. So I traveled him back from Oklahoma, Maryland, and buried him in our little family cemetery in Duncanville. So that has been the family joke.
So he even traveled after he died.
He traveled after he died. He sure did. He would have gotten a kick out of that, though, actually.
He would have.
Yeah, he would have.
Wonderful. You know, in your story about the garage is very pertinent because I have had people, usually women, who have a washer and dryer in the garage. And when the garage is connected somehow to the suicide death for different reasons, but they can't do their laundry.
No, that is absolutely true.
You can't do your laundry. And in the old days, everybody had their washer and dryer in the garage.
Right. That's where mine were.
Yeah. And, you know, nowadays, often they're in your house, inside the house or something, in a utility room or something. Yeah. But that garage can be a really difficult place to go. And even if it was their workshop and so on, mm-hmm. it still has, and different other rooms in your house can have certain points of just times when you just cannot do it. You can't go into those rooms. You can't. It's just too hard. And you have to give yourself the time and the grace to either do that or move. It's perfectly fine to just move too, if you can. If you're renting, you can move an apartment, move. And the old adage of not making major decisions right away doesn't hold.
No.
Not in this time.
No,
So I encourage people to kind of have a little bit more flexibility in those things. So I love the story about the garage. That's really important.
I still have the house. It's been rented all of these years that I've been up here. I'm planning on moving back to Texas, but I'm not planning on moving back into the house. It was my mother and dad's house that I inherited. I don't want to live there. Um, and the reason being that I would always have, every time I walked to the garage or put a car in there, I would always have, that memory. So at some point I will have another house when I get moved back to Texas.
Ah, well,
Yeah.
good news. I didn't know you were moving back to Texas sometime.
Yeah. I've spent since 1993 up here, and after the horrid snowstorm we've had over the last 6 weeks, I'm about done with this place. I mean, it's just been awful.
So can you think of other ways that your life has changed since Ray died?
I think when a person experiences something like that, Marilyn, I think it makes them much more compassionate toward people. And I have really tried my very best, to be much more aware of people's feelings and have lived my life. I had a decision to make. I don't know if this ever gets talked about in y'all's groups or not, but I had a decision, and that decision was whether or not I was going to live and live well or not. And my decision was to live well to the best of my ability, to honor his life as well as our life together. And so in that regard, I think I have done a pretty fair job of that. Obviously, in the line of work that I'm in, I meet people on their very worst days sometimes. And I try to be really mindful about that. The other thing that I have learned about myself is that when tough things happen, I can handle them, which was really kind of a learning process, I think, for me. When, I lost my daughter almost 9 years ago. And when I got the call about her, I answered my granddaughter. I said, I can't get out of here today. I'll be home tomorrow. So there's something, that changed in me that allows me to handle pretty significant things in a pretty calm way. And in dealing with people with mental health issues, you have to be able to do that.
And just to clarify, your daughter died in an accident.
Car accident.
Car accident.
Yes.
But it's still hard. It's hard to lose an immediate member of your family.
Yes.
Very hard. Yeah.
I encourage the people that I work with, to live their life and to be happy as they can be, given the circumstances that they're dealing with. And I know that sometimes that is hard. And so sometimes I do a lot of work around helping them explore things that they used to enjoy, but because of what's happened in their life, they've stopped doing those things, and help them explore, those things that have brought them a smile to their face, to go back to some of that, so that they know that they can go forward. And it's not easy at times. It's not.
It's not easy. It's easy to be down in that pit and trying to
Yes.
crawl out of it with its slippery slides.
Yep.
And you keep falling back, and it's just a difficult place to be. But there are so many of us in that same spot, so
Yep.
many people, and in any kind of a death. I mean,
Right.
other deaths too, like your daughter, is a hard thing to have to adjust to and live without. And
Yes.
what do you do with your life?
Well, I went back to school and started working on after her death. I went back to school and started working on my PhD,
Good for you.
exploring how families manage losing family members, friends by violent means.
So is that your dissertation?
Yes,
Yeah, well, that and only a person that's been there can really write well about that, don't you think? I mean,
yeah.
it's really hard to
Yeah.
understand any of this if you haven't been there.
No, that is true. I think one of the interesting things that I found out is that none of the professors that are involved in my, as my group, have experienced any sort of violent death. And so as a result, they don't know very much about, dying and death and, all of that sort of stuff. And so not only am I doing this dissertation, but I'm also having to, kind of lead them into, new areas that they're certainly are unfamiliar with.
Mm. Well, they need more of that lived experience in order to really educate a community, the bigger, wide community, about how devastating a violent death is, and I've realized how, not just how devastating it is, but how long lasting.
Well, it's forever.
Yeah.
It may not, it certainly is not as acute as it was the first number of years after his death. But I have to sit here and tell you, Marilyn, that there are sometimes that, around an anniversary date, there'll be something that will pop up that will trip me up after all of these years, and it's been 30 some odd years.
Mm.
So it pops up every now and then. I'm sure it probably does for you too.
Yeah, I've had things that have happened, and it just kind of just gives me the shudders. And
Yes.
I think the last time I had a really gut-wrenching sob was like 10 years after Steve died.
Mhm.
But those things can happen, and they're really very normal for us,
Yes.
very, very normal for us, and very common among us.
Yes.
And I think that's true about violent deaths. They're just so difficult to deal with.
Yes.
So with that, so tell me, one of the things that is new, that I knew for you that you didn't do before, I'm thinking, is your writing. You've written a book
Yes.
called When Someone You Love Completes Suicide.
Yes.
Tell us
And
a little bit about the inspiration for that book and how that came about.
I started looking for something to read about spousal suicide pretty quick after his death. Could not find anything. There was nothing written about spousal suicide during the time at the time that I was looking for things. And so I just decided I'm going to put something down. And so I started, and actually I stumbled into meeting Janet and Joy at the centering conference, at their corporation. And I met them at one of the AAS meetings a number of years after his death. And I felt like that, if there wasn't information out there about spousal suicide, there needed to be, because it is a unique, it's a unique death. It's a unique occurrence. And I felt like that I wasn't the only one that probably needed to have some information. So I did. Yeah, and it's still in print. And I don't know, the last one, and this one, we didn't get the title changed to the new wording, because I think the new wording that they're using now is, it would read, when someone you love dies by suicide. I think they've transitioned to dies by suicide.
And you have a copy of that book there. I have a picture of it, but I don't have the book. There is the book. Okay. That's what it looks like.
This is the latest one. This is the one before
Okay.
the Four Seasons. And then I don't have the other two here at the office with me. But there were two other printings of it too. So it's been in print since a long time.
Good for you. Yeah, that's exciting. And you can get that book on Amazon, I believe, and on Centering Corporation
Centering Corporation. Yeah.
is an organization that sells books, books on
books.
grief,
Yeah.
different kinds of grief and a lot of books. They have a catalog. You might want to look for Sondra's book there, or look on Amazon. You'll find it there. I did that just this morning. And it's just wonderful that you were able to do something. There is not a lot, still is not a lot out there on spousal grief.
No, there's not.
Most of the books are written by moms
Yes.
who have lost their children.
Yes.
The moms sometimes write kind of almost like a memorial or tribute to their child. But the majority of books are written by moms.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's a few men that have written a few books, but their men books are very limited. And strictly on spousal support, spousal loss,
Right.
is even fewer. So
I don't know if you remember this or not, but I was the editor of the newsletter from the AAS group for the survivors.
mhm.
And I was able to start a men's column in that newsletter. And then when I stepped down as being the editor, I had men that were scrambling, to want to write an article for the men, because it was called the Men's Corner. And because at that time, there weren't many men that were represented in the newsletter, as survivors. And I had stepped down, and then the column disappeared. And I thought that was really sad, because I had tapped into, had occasion, excuse me, I had occasion to have a conversation with Ted Turner, who was the start of one of the movie channels on TV.
CNN, is it CNN?
CNN, yeah.
Turner Broadcasting.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, he was fascinating. His dad had killed himself. And so he was thinking about writing a short column for me. And then I stepped down, and with some editorial concerns that I had in terms of what they were doing with the newsletter. And so he never wrote the article for me.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
and
too
I always
bad.
thought it was really, I thought it was really sad that they took that column away, because it was at least the start, of having men offer some, different perceptions.
Yeah, most of the people that call us are women. We get, this is much smaller percentage call us first timers that are
Right.
men. And at meetings, it's the same kind of thing. And I always kind of joke about, men usually won't talk if there's a bunch of gabby women around that will talk. And
Right.
so we
They
have had separate breakout rooms for men. And they
Oh.
said, and I've had them come up to me later and say that was the best thing you could have done for me, is to find one man to facilitate that will talk, and he can get the other men that will then talk. And I think our culture is such that men just have been trained to not verbalize their emotions as much.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
as far as in a group or publicly. And so there are a few men that have written books about it. Some
Mhm.
professional men have written about it, losing a parent when they were a child. and
Right.
that sort of thing, but very little written by men. So anytime we can encourage the men to talk and share, because they have every right to be heard as much as women do.
Absolutely.
And it's
need
good
to
for
be.
everybody. It's good for everybody.
Yeah. And need to be heard because it encourages others. So,
Well, and the suicide rate is mostly men anyway. For
yeah.
approximately 4 out of 5 suicide deaths are males. So that they're not allowing themselves to really get help or to talk. And it's part
Right.
of it's our culture. But anyway, I'm glad you wrote this about spousal loss. That's wonderful. So I hope people will look for that book. Can you tell us a little bit about your life in Alaska now, what it's like being the professional there, and what you've been doing there, and obviously you're looking at coming back to the continental United States sometime,
Yeah.
back to Texas where your family is and your grandchildren and your great grandchildren. So
Yeah.
it's hard to be away
All of
from
which
them.
have, yeah, all of which have visited up here, with the exception of the great grands. They haven't been up here. But all my kids, all of them have been up here. Deirdre had made a number of trips up here. We traveled together up into Canada. So I have been in practice since I moved up here. I was in practice in Dallas as well. And then when I moved up here, I started a practice. And this winter, I've just tried to keep up with the snow. I looked out my front door here last week, I guess it was week before last, and I thought somebody had transplanted Mount Everest in the front of my house. It was all snow berms.
Oh my.
Oh yeah, it was a hoot. I've got some pictures. I'll send them to you. Anyway, I mostly have my practice, and I do a few community things, but mostly. And then when I started work on this dissertation, that has taken up an enormous amount of time. But I'm at the point of getting ready to start reaching out to people to ask them to be part of my study. So you can look forward to that.
Oh,
So, it's been a process, and there have been times that I just, would look at it and go, I just don't know if I'm going to finish this or not, but I will finish it. I would like to be finished with it by the end of this year. It depends on the next couple of weeks in terms of whether or not I get a pass on my proposal.
okay.
So, yeah. So getting ready to defend that proposal.
Well, it's been a joy to have you here with us. And I'm so excited to see you again on Zoom, at least. We haven't
Yes,
seen each
me
other in
too.
a few years because we have missed the AAS conferences, is when you and I would show up together,
Yep.
and you would sit next to me, and this little package would be under your chair, and I never knew for a long time that was your dog.
Yep.
He was under there. I don't know
That
how you got him on the airlines.
Well, at that time, I was paying for her to travel with me. That was Feather.
Oh, really?
And yeah, and now I have Arabella, who's a long hair Chihuahua as well. And she, because she is trained and wears a harness when we're working, not today, but she gets to travel free with me. And so she has made lots of trips back and forth to Texas and to a couple of conferences down in California. And she's a good traveler. She's a great traveler. But yeah, yep. And she doesn't ride in a carry bag like Feather did. So yeah.
I was shocked the first time I realized that. Anyway, it's been a joy and a privilege to have you as our guest in our Friends for Survival webinars series that we do. And just to kind of, for our audiences to get to know you and your journey after the death of your husband, Ray. And we welcome you back, and we're grateful that you've been on our mailing list for many years, maybe 30 years.
Yeah, few years.
And we have lots of people that have been on our mailing list for well over 20 and 30 years, because you still get something good out of it, and it's still encouragement, and Susan's editing and formatting and writing in our newsletter has just been such a great resource for people.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I pass those around, Marilyn.
You do. You pass our newsletter around Alaska, huh?
Yeah, I do.
Thank you so much, Sandra.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm so glad we were able to connect again. And again, maybe we'll see each other again in another webinar. Who knows?
Hope so.
At the end of this webinar, you will be able to see a page which will have resources on it and so on.
Okay.
So please, as viewers, pay attention to that, and you will see how you can get Sondra's book and many other resources that we may have. You just need to contact us. So thank you so much for being with us today.
You're very welcome.
I wish you well in your continued career and possible retirement someday.
Yeah, well, no, I doubt that.
Thank you.
Thank you
you
so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thank you.